Hello and welcome everyone to the CyVerse webinar series. I'm Tina Lee, CyVerse's User Engagement Officer. Today's webinar is titled Using iCommands for Flexibility and Control in Moving Data in CyVerse, presented by Eric Lyons. For those of you who are new to CyVerse, we are a cyber infrastructure project funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation, and we offer these webinars to train scientists on how to use CyVerse's computational resources, which fulfills a key part of our mission. First, let's take care of some quick housekeeping. Today's presentation is approximately 30 minutes. Please mute your audio, stop any screen sharing, but do open your Zoom chat window where you can type any questions you have for Eric, and he'll answer those either after the presentation or perhaps during, and he's invited me to interrupt him, so if there's something critical, I will. The webinar recording and other materials will be posted on our website later today or latest on Monday for you to review at any time. In addition to these webinars, we, CyVerse, are virtualizing our training events, and most of our learning materials are already online. So please visit our website learning pages for resources on how to use CyVerse for teaching or for teaching yourself. I also want to highlight that we have an upcoming remote workshop in November to be jointly taught by CyVerse and NEON, which stands for the National Ecological Observatory Network, on using and analyzing remote sensing data generated by NEON's airborne observation platform. So that's in November. You can also find information on our website events page. And now I'm pleased to introduce Eric Lyons, one of CyVerse's co-PIs. Eric is an associate professor in the School of Plant Sciences at the U of A, University of Arizona. His research focuses on scalable computational systems and infrastructure to support and accelerate life science research, and the structure, evolution, and dynamics of genomes. As a postdoc, he developed a comparative genomics platform called Koji, which currently stores nearly 33,000 genomes and provides dynamic tools for analyzing, comparing, and visualizing genomic data. He is the author of over 70 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and serves on the boards of the nonprofit Phoenix Bioinformatics, Built Plant Sciences Institute at Iowa State University, and the Boyce Thompson Institute in Ithaca, New York. Hello, Eric.
Hi, Tina. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite platforms inside of CyVerse, which is the data store. And I'm going to be focusing on one of my favorite ways to communicate with the data store, which is through some command line tools called the iCommands. And the reason that they're called the iCommands is that the data store is based on a software platform called iRods. And the iCommands are the way for interfacing with iRods. But one of the things is, before we begin, sorry about that. Before we start, one of the things that would be great is if people do want to follow along and try some of these commands for yourself. And if you do end up having questions or problems as you're typing things in, this is a great opportunity to post those questions, and we'll do our best to help you get going. So the things that you're going to need if you want to follow along is you're going to have a CyVerse user account. I'm going to assume most people here have one, but if you don't, you may want to get one started right now. It may take a couple of minutes for your account to get activated throughout CyVerse's systems. But to do so, all you need to do is go to user.cyverse.org in order to register. And if you do register, please make sure to fill out your account information, including such things as your ORCID ID, your institution, where you're from. This kind of information is useful for CyVerse to understand who's using the platform for our reporting back to the National Science Foundation. And then the next thing is you're going to need to have the iCommands installed. And there's a variety of ways to get those installed depending on your operating system. And I've generated some teeny links here for people who may not have already installed it but want to our CyVerse documentation for Linux, for Mac, and for Windows. And just one of the things that I want to note, that if you are a Windows user, you're going to need to have the Linux subsystem installed, and then you're going to need to install Linux on top of that. So this is probably going to take quite a while to make that happen beyond what we're going to be able to do to get this started. If you do have any questions, just post them in chat throughout this presentation. I did tell Tina to interrupt me. I'm happy to do my best to help as we're going through this. So just to begin a little bit, the big reason around the iCommands and the data store in general comes down to this question of why should we care? Why should we care as researchers? And why should life science researchers care in particular? Although this spans across all domains of science. And if you're a life science researcher, you probably have seen this graph, which is the cost of sequencing 1 megabase of DNA sequence, approximately 1 megabyte worth. So 20 years ago, that would cost you close to $10,000 to do. And then what we see is this rapid decrease in those costs. And this is driven by acceleration of new technologies coming on the market for sequencing DNA. So 20 years ago, we had what was known as Gen 1 of next generation sequencing technology. And then around 2007, 2008, a new version of this technology came online that was massively parallelized. This really started to drive down the costs. That leveled out until about 5 years ago or so, when another new version of this technology came online that drove the costs down even further. So what used to cost $10,000, you now can get done for a penny or less. And of course, this trend just continues to happen through over time. And so what that means is that today, everyone or anyone can sequence a genome pretty much of any organism that they want to. So when the first human genome was released back in 2001, that was a culmination of about 10 years of work consisting of hundreds of researchers and cost somewhere between $1 and $2 billion. And today you can generate about the same amount of data for less than $1,000 in a day. And that technology just continues to accelerate. So this is just showing one of the latest sequencing technologies by Oxford Nanopore, which is this little tiny sequencer that fits in the palm of your hand and just plugs into a laptop. And they're currently producing, or will release soon, a version of their sequencing technology to generate data around the world, observing the world around us is just phenomenal. And of course, it's not limited just to DNA technology. There's all sorts of great imaging platforms where you can do LiDAR or 3D reconstructions and generate point clouds. These are 2 images showing a zoomed in version of a laser scan of an environment, as well as one that has close to 18 billion data points for a region of coastal California. We also have great new imaging technologies in terms of hyperspectral that are being used, thermal imaging. We can take these sensors, we can miniaturize them, we can fly them around on drones, and we can just generate a huge array of data just on a quantitative scale that we've never been able to do before. And just as an example of one of the projects that I'm involved with, that was recently featured in the Wall Street Journal. If people want to see what one of these platforms looks like, you can follow this teeny URL, and I recommend watching the movie. But this is a 30-ton gantry system that rolls up and down 2 acres of cropland. And then underneath this, we can grow diversity of crops here in the Arizona desert, primarily interested in heat stress and drought stress. But if you take a look at this gantry, that box in the middle is the payload, and inside of there are affixed dozens of sensors for imaging this crop day and night. And so the system took about 1 year to build. It's now been running for 3 to 4 years. And these sensors can generate upwards of 10 terabytes of raw data per day as this thing runs. And just to put that in perspective, if you're flying multiple drones, you can easily generate a terabyte or more per day. If you have a field tractor or single camera or a variety of sensors, all of these things can be just flooding us with a huge amount of data and information. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we need ways to organize, manage, and very importantly, share that not only with our collaborators, but with the broader research community. Because ultimately, at the end, what we're generating in terms of any of these systems is often more data than we have time to analyze as individual researchers. And while we may have specific research questions on which we're focused, one of the important things is that these data often have additional value to other researchers for experiments that we might not directly be interested in. And if you are interested in this high throughput phenotyping data, in addition to the NEON workshop, which is dealing with airborne observation platforms for NEON, there's another workshop focused on this system, specifically on our workflows and the data and how to access those data, which will be later this year on November 20th. So when it comes to a workflow and how do we manage these data, I'm just going to give you the example of what we're dealing with the Scantry system, and then I'm going to talk about one that's more typical of what I call a regular research project. So the Scantry system, as I said before, is generating terabytes of data per day, and these are tens of thousands of individual files. These files get streamed from these sensors to a computer that's stored in that green box over there on the right, which we call the Scantry server, or servers. Those data then get sent over to a cache server that's on site that has lots and lots of storage. This cache server then has automated programs that will take a day worth of scan for each one of the sensors. It will then tar them up and compress them. And then it will send them over to the CyVerse data store. And the important thing that I want to emphasize here is that the tarring and compressing does two things. It reduces the number of files to tens of files, and it makes these really, really big files. And when it comes to moving data to and from the CyVerse data store, while it can handle lots of small files, the real performance can get unlocked when you're moving around larger files. And this comes down to one of the core technologies that's embedded within it around parallel file transfers. Now, once these data are in the CyVerse data store, now we need to do things with them. This is just raw data. So often one of the things that we do is we'll send them over to a high performance computing cluster that then will crunch on these data for a few hours and spit out results that we then want to feed back into the CyVerse data store. Those data then can be used in a variety of other computational platforms, such as a high-resolution image scanner or image viewer called BISC, which also happens to run through CyVerse. But more importantly, we're extracting from these images and other sensors phenotype data. And so once we have done things such as quantify greenness and photosynthetic activity, canopy cover, even individual leaves, my audio is occasionally pixelating. Close tabs I'm not using. Tina, let me know if it gets worse. I am running nothing on this computer besides this.
Sorry.
But if anyone is having some audio problems, you can always just post, hey, can you repeat that over in chat? But once we get all those extracted phenotype data, then we want to do additional analyses. So we can take a look at growth curves or performance curves or ultimate yield from how these plants perform. And we want to be able to pull those data out and put them into an environment that lets us do that relatively easily. For example, a Jupyter notebook, or maybe it's some specific R apps or other things along those lines. So in terms of a typical data management workflow, where you're not necessarily dealing with one of those large, high data generation systems, it may be something like you do have a sequencer in your lab and you're sequencing stuff. So you may go ahead and generate some sequencing data. Those then get stored on your local computer. And then you want to go ahead and take those and send them up to the CyVerse data store. Then once in their CyVerse data store, you might use apps to assemble that genome or annotate that genome or quality control check your read files. You could do that in the CyVerse discovery environment or another computing system. You might want to take those data and share them with collaborators because you don't know how to do those analyses yourself. You then may want to do some more work with those processed data. Again, you could be sending it off to a Jupyter notebook or an R Shiny app or R Studio. And there's some systems inside of CyVerse called Vice that make running those very simple and very easy. And of course, at the end of the day, once your data have been processed, you've written up your great publication, you now want to make all these things available to the general public, and the data store allows that to happen as well. So what's inside the data store? And I just want to spend a moment talking about the Unix file system, because what the data store will do is it's going to present to you a file structure very similar to a Unix file system. And all Unix file systems have what's known as root, which is a very base, low level, or top level, depending on which way you want to think about this, of the file system. And that's often just represented by a slash. And then you have directories that are hanging off of that. And the way the CyVerse data store is structured is you've got your root, and then you're going to have one directory that we're going to be able to see called iPlant. Now, it's called iPlant for historical reasons. This was the original name for CyVerse a decade ago. And as the project changed name, changing the name of this directory, especially when you have petabytes of data, just would have taken way too long for most of our users. So we just kept that as iPlant. And then after iPlant, underneath there, you've got this directory called home. Now, home is where most of the user accounts, all the user accounts directories are going to be stored. And so it's always important to know where your home is. So you're going to have iPlant home and then a subdirectory based on your CyVerse username. And so this will be your home. So for me, my username is eLions. So my home is iPlant home/eLions. And if you take a look at the directories in home, you're going to see everyone else's directory to which you have been given access. So if somebody shares a file with you, you can go in there. But in addition to that, there's also other places such as a shared directory. This is for public projects and private projects in terms of data that might be shared across multiple collaborators or made fully public. And one of the common places and one of the resources that we have at CyVerse is to not just make data publicly available for everyone to use, but also issue a DOI or digital object identifier. And those are held under a directory called iPlant Home Shared Commons Repo. So if you are interested in making your data fully available through the data store, there are means to do that as well, which is one of the great advantages of being able to get your data into the CyVerse data store. So in terms of accessing the CyVerse data store, while I'm going to be focusing on the commands, the iCommands, I do want people to know that there are other ways to access it, depending on what you like to use and what you're familiar with. There's the discovery environment, which is CyVerse's digital workbench. It has access to the data store. That's shown right here, and I'm just viewing my home directory. There is CyberDuck, which is a standalone program that's a graphical user interface that lets you drag and drop files between a local computer and the CyVerse data store. And so that's a screenshot of CyberDuck over here on the left. And what I just want you to see is that the contents in these directories are all identical. Similarly, if you want to, you can actually mount this so it appears as a folder on your computer. And finally, at the end, we've got the command line driven for it. So what I want to emphasize about all of these different methods is that there are all different ways to view contents inside the data store, let you see what's there, move files, make some changes. But each one of them has particular strengths and weaknesses. So for example, doing a web dev mount is very convenient in terms of having it just look like part of your native file system on your computer. But moving data to and from that is very, very slow. And that's due to two major reasons, which is number one, the software stack that is required to make that appear as a folder just goes through a lot of layers, so it slows down transfers. And then the other thing is it's not going to be a parallel port for moving data back and forth. It's just going to be what we call single-threaded. And so it's good for browsing, it's good for moving and dealing with small files, but if you really want to move big files around, I would definitely recommend moving into iCommands. Parallel file transfers are supported by CyberDuck and a limited sense in the discovery environment. But it just depends in terms of if you like using a mouse or if you like typing. I'm going to pause there for a moment and just, Tina, I've noticed that there was a lot of chat messages. Were there any questions?
No, it's just about whether the slides would be posted later on our website, which they will.
The slides will be posted later, and I will be using these slides as an example of how to move data into the CyVerse data store, sharing them, generating a quick share link, and then seeing if anyone online today can get a copy of them. So why iCommands? Why do I like the iCommands? What are some of the powers behind it? Well, it mimics the Unix command line, which for me, typing is much, much, much faster than mousing around. The other thing about iCommands is that it allows you to integrate file movement into programs much more easily, and at the same time, you can automate tasks. So for example, if you are generating data on a regular basis and you want to be able to bundle those up and send them to the data store and to have that happen on a regular basis, iCommands is the way to make that happen. They're also highly configurable. So there's a lot of options that you can specify with these commands that give you a lot more power, configurability, as well as reliability and performance. And so one of the key things I do want to emphasize is that parallel file transfer. But in order to take full advantage of moving data quickly, it's going to really require two things, which is you want to have a large file that can be split up and parallelized and sent across. If you're sending a bunch of small files, like I said, they will work, but you are going to have some additional overhead that's going to slow down the overall performance. And the reason for that is every file that gets created in the CyVerse data store has to get registered, gets entered into a reliable database. This allows for the lookups and search capabilities, but that takes time. And so there's going to be some overhead on that. So if you are dealing with thousands of files and you want to deal with those files in bulk, so it's not like you're always going to download all 1,000 of them, I would recommend bundling them together in a tarball, in a zip, whatever you're most familiar with. It's also a very portable way to deal with the data store. And what I mean by that is installing the iCommands on whatever computer you have access to is not necessarily a big deal. And I mean that in the sense of as long as you're not on Windows machines. But since most of the systems that we use to do our work are Unix or Linux based in one form or another, it really makes it easy so that you could be hopping to an HPC resource, you could be firing up a virtual machine, it could be something that's done in a commercial cloud. All of those things can have access to it. And just out of curiosity, has anyone here used Exceed, our national supercomputing network in the US for science provided by the National Science Foundation? You can just, type yes. So, easy to go ahead and get iCommands installed. If you're using a Jupyter notebook or related technologies, you often have a terminal. This is going to be Linux based. You can use that to install iCommands and move data back and forth. Same with R Shiny and our Studio. And of course, anyone who's playing around in the clouds, chances are you can eventually land on a Linux machine to make these things happen. But one of the things I want people to appreciate is just keep in mind, there are some tasks that might just be easier through a graphical user interface, a GUI, or a web interface. And there are definitely things that I do with the CyVerse data store that I use the web interface through the discovery environment to do, just because it's faster and easier than doing it through the iCommands. And so I'm definitely not saying that iCommands are the all end all, but they are definitely a good tool in your toolbox in order to get your work done. So how do you install them? There are a variety of documentation that's available. And what I'm going to do is I will go through this process to get these installed if people are interested, just to sort of show you what it looks like. I'm going to go ahead and install it on my Mac. So I'm going to click on that link. That link will take me down to setting up iCommands for Mac. So CyVerse has an installer. This was written by another co-PI on CyVerse named Nirav Merchant. So I'm going to go ahead and download that. I will open it. My installer is running. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to share more of my desktop in order for people to see everything. Give me one moment just to change my share settings. Stop share, share screen, desktop. All right. So since Mac has made things a little more secure, I can't instantly run this. I have to open up my preferences, give it specific permission to do so. That'll be under security. Go ahead and say open it anyway. I trust CyVerse mostly. And then it will take me through the install process. Continue, continue, I agree. I've promised I've read all of this in great detail before, and I agree with everything that's in there. I'm going to go ahead and install this and install for all the users.
Eric, there's a question about whether it's possible to open the installer by right-clicking on it and then clicking open.
Yeah, you can definitely do that as well. But depending on how your system is set up, you may run into Mac or other operating system securities that, because this has not been registered through Apple and certified, you're going to have to give it explicit permissions to open it. So that's it. Now it's installed. So I would recommend other people to do something similar. And if you would like me to wait, I am happy to do so. I'm going to bring back open my chat again because I lost that. Chat. Perfect. So I now have it installed. But now the next thing that I need to do is I need to initialize my connection to the CyVerse data store. And so over here, I have a terminal that's already open. And if anyone on a Mac needs to find this, you just type in terminal in your search and you'll find terminal. This is also in your apps folder. And so with it, for the first time, once you've installed it, you may need to set some environmental variables. These have already been set for me, or I set them up earlier, but I'm just going to go through the initialization process, which is I'll type in the first iCommand to get started, which is init, and I hit return. And what it will say is, it will say your environmental file, irods_environment.json, is missing. You're going to have to tell me who to connect to. So we're going to type in the host name for the data store, which will be data.cyverse.org. It's then going to ask for the port number. This is a particular sort of proverbial door on the server that we want to knock on to get access, and that is 1247. I do have this information on this slide, but they're also in all the documentation for accessing the CyVerse data store. Going to put in your username. This is your CyVerse username. So for me, that's Elians. The zone, put in iPlant for this. And then your CyVerse password. And if everything worked, it'll just drop you back to the terminal again. And I am now connected to the CyVerse data store. So what's important to realize about this is that once you've initialized your connection to the data store through this means on a particular computer, you don't have to re-enter this information ever again, unless you want to delete it and clear it out. So what this means is that every time I initiate a connection or transfer to or from the data store, all this configuration has been saved. And it's saved in a hidden directory in your home folder on your computer. And if people are curious, I'm happy to show you where that is and what that looks like. So how do we actually I'm just reading one of your comments. Wayne, thank you for posting that. Firewalls can play an issue if you can't get over port 1247, although most of those are out there. And so you do have some opportunities to try to tunnel through another port to get to it. But that's going to be a little bit beyond the scope of this tutorial today. So how do you navigate around the data store with the iCommands? It's going to be very similar to that of using regular Unix or Linux shell commands. So if I type in ls in my shell, it's going to give me a listing of my directories in my current working directory in Linux. So this idea of your working directory is wherever you currently are at the moment. So ls is in my home on my Mac here, and this gives me a view of all the directories that I have. Now the iCommands are very similar, except for you often put an I in front of it. So if I want to list my contents in the data store, I type in ILS. So ls is my local, ILS is showing me what's in the data store. If you want to change directories, so if you want to navigate around the data store, the command for that is cd. So locally, I would type in cd. We'll go to, let's see, I'll go to my applications, type in ls. Don't have any applications there. I'll go to my documents, type in ls. I've got some folders inside there. And similarly for the data store, it would be the same thing. So if I wanted to go to a directory called projects, I would type in ICD projects. I would now change to that directory and I can type in ILS and I can see the projects that I have in that particular directory. One of the things, if you're not familiar with the command line that I just wanted to make note of, is if you just type in change directory cd alone, it'll return you to your home, which is, you know, for my Mac, it's users elians. And if I type in icd, my home is iPlant home elians. And so you may have noticed that I've typed in this command pwd and ipwd. Pwd just prints out my current working directory, print working directory, and that there's an analog in the iCommands world called ipwd, which will print out where your current working directory is. I'm going to pause for a moment because I see that there are some questions going on. iCommands on Ubuntu 20.04 is not working, and you had to install in 18.4. Nirav, you probably can answer that one. From my work on 20.04, I have had it work, so it might be dealing with precompiled binaries, and you may have to compile it. I can't remember. Can you access the shared data? Can you go to iPlant home shared? That's a great question, Alexander. So yeah, let's go there. So I can go to icd/home, iPlant shared. I obviously don't know it. iPlant home shared. Type in ILS, and now this will give me a list of all the shared project directories that I may or may not have access to. And I just realized that if we all type this in, it may take a little while to generate it, but there's a bunch of shared directories that are out there. There's something called Astrolabe, BioViz, Brassica Dwarf, some Neon stuff, iVirus, iMicrobe. There's one in here called TerraRef, which is where Scantry data is currently stored. And then there should be one called Commons Repo, which is where data could be staged to make fully available. So in here, there may be a lot. There's one called Elians HiSeq 2000. That one looks like an old sequencing project of mine. And there are some sequencing files in there. So I'm going to go ahead and return home. And I just want to say that if you want to delete a file, it's again that very similar to Unix, which is RM, but in the iCommands world, it's IRM. If you want to make a directory, so I'm back in my home, I want to make a new directory called temp2. I can just type in imaker temp2, type in ILS again, and you can see now that I have the temp2 directory. I realize that I don't want that, so I want to remove it. I'm going to type in IRM, knowing I'm missing something here, temp2. This will give me an error because that's a directory, and I have to give it a special flag called recursion-r to remove that directory. And there may be a command called remove dir IRM dir to do it. And sometimes you will notice a little performance hit, especially if there's a lot of people playing around, creating directories, deleting directories all simultaneously. So I'm just going to make that a background process and not wait for it and just go ahead and move on. So one of the things I do want to mention too is that if you are new to working at the command line in Linux, one of the things that you probably want to get a good handle on is this difference between an absolute path and a relative path. I'm not going to go through that in too much detail today, but I just wanted to put that out there. So now we want to have some fun, and we want to now push and pull data back and forth from the data store. And the commands for doing that are iPut to put data and iGet to get data from the data store. So I am going to go to my temporary folder in the data store. And I see that I've got a couple of big tarball, or I've got a couple of tarballs in there. And I'm going to navigate to my desktop where I have, what do I have over here? I have some screenshots from some Zoom chats. So if I want to go ahead and put one of those over there, all I need to do is type in iPut and type in one of these names. Since these contain spaces, I'm just going to copy that and put it between two quotes. I'll then go ahead and just do the iPut. It returns just fine. And if I type in ILS, I will see in there that there is my photo that I've sent across. Now, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that there are a lot of options that you can include with one of these iPut or iGet commands. A big one is the -r option. So if you're transferring a directory with lots of files in it or additional directories, you want to do a recursive put. So you want to give it the -r. And then there are a variety of flags that are useful just to help you understand what's happening in the data store. So a -P will dump out on the screen the progress of the upload. A -T will renew the socket connection every 10 minutes. This is often useful if you're dealing with connections that are failing due to some issue or firewall setting where long-standing connections get cut. And adding a lowercase v or a capital V will add verbosity to the transfer process, which will tell you everything that the program is doing that the programmers have put in. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer over another one of these files. I'm going to add in those options, -P. I'll skip the T. I'll add the T, although it's not going to take 10 minutes. But I'll make it display progress as well as give me what's happening in terms of the transfer. So it says that it's creating my connections. It's going through the process of transferring it. It's sent it over in 4 seconds at a relatively slow rate. And the reason for this is it's just a relatively small file. to do it. But we're going to take a look at that performance when we're going to be bringing some of these larger files back over here. So I want to know how big those other files are. So I'm going to add the option -L, which is the long list for ILS, which will give me some of the sizes. And so what I can see here is that these are very big files. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's a 300 gig file. That's an 88 gig file. Those are going to be a little bit too big. I mean, they're plenty big. It's just going to take too long to transfer as a demonstration. But over here, I did create a couple of files called Big Bad Data. So I'm going to grab that. But I want to skip over to the next slide here, which is about the iGet command. So iPut is to put data in the data store. iGet is to bring it back. And the options are very similar that are often useful. Are you getting a directory and you want to do it recursively? Do you want to display progress? Do you want to renew the socket connection? Do you want it to be verbose? The -F flag is for force. If you try to put a file in either direction that already exists on your computer, it's going to block you from doing that. To give you a chance to say, wait a second, are you overwriting a file that is important to you? You should double check that. And you could always just put in the -F flag to force it and say, just do it and overwrite what's already there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go get that big bag data file but I'm going to add the display the progress, go ahead and make it very verbose, renew my socket connection. And now what we'll see is the initiation of the connection. And since you're looking at my whole screen, you can see that I have at the top here some network monitors. So currently, I'm on a very fast network. I'm moving data at about 120 megabytes per second. And so we can see how fast this is coming across over here. Right here, it says number of threads. This is the number of parallel transfers that it's doing simultaneously to move this. It maxes out at about 16 or so. It may be lower depending on what your network is. iRods or the iCommands will sense your network and open up as many threads as it can. Yeah, you can put your file anywhere that you have access to, but you have to specify the path to where it is. Otherwise, it drops it into what your current working directory is. So I had navigated to, let's see, I'd navigated into temp and then uploaded data there. If I had said from my home directory in iRods, put the file in /temp, it would have done that. The -Q option. So if you want to know more about any of the commands, you can just type in the command and it will go ahead and give you all of the options. So I'm doing that while this thing here is going through the process and transferring it. And so the IQ command, I'll have to say I'm not familiar with it. And it says use the RBUDP datagram protocol for the data transfer. Now, off the top of my head, I don't exactly know what that is. So this is a case where I would have to go through and take a look at what this protocol is and how it affects my data transfer. But Teresa, if you are super interested in this, please feel free to email me and I'll be happy to go look up that information and send it over to you. But over here, we can now take a look at the progress of the transfer. So it's gone through, printed up some progress along the way, and that because I had verbose on, it went ahead and gave me some summary statistics at the very end, which said we transferred a 9 gig file in a little under 100 seconds using 16 threads with a throughput that averaged 91 megabytes per second. And so this is the basics of how we do stuff. And so if I type in ls, there's my big bag data. And I just want to show you that if I try to put big bag data back into the data store, it's going to run into the version of the file that's currently on the data store and won't let me move it. It'll give me an error and it says, sorry, we have an error. We will not overwrite it without the force flag. So now if I wanted to overwrite it, I would type in -F, and that would force an overwrite. But for right now, I'm going to leave these two files right here. And the reason is, even though I've transferred data back and forth, some of the best practices may dictate that you do an additional check to make sure that there were no errors introduced in that transfer. And you can review that often using what's known as a checksum, which is an algorithm that will generate a unique identifier based on the contents of that file, a unique hash based on the contents of that file. And you can use that to compare what's in the data store, that checksum value, with the one on the file that you just downloaded. I can do iChecksum, big bad data, and it'll give me this unique hash right here. And then I can do a checksum. Do I have to do MD5 on my local one? And now my computer is going to go ahead and crunch that number. So the data store has already calculated these checksum values and have stored them for each one of the data files. I'm going to generate the same checksum value on my computer. Since again, this is a 7 GB file, this will take a little while to generate. But if this file is identical to the file in the data store, these checksum values will be identical. So I'll go ahead and I'll just let that run for a little while. So now the next thing that's sort of important is sharing data in the data store. So we've put some data up there. How do we go ahead and share it? And so when it comes to sharing, there's two general ways that you may want to share. One are with collaborators. So this would then restrict access to those data to only people that you trust and have also a CyVerse account. And you would do that inside of the discovery environment by selecting a file in your data store. You click on the data tab, select a file, click on these three little buttons right here, and then click share with collaborators. And then when you do that, a window would pop up that would let you type in by first name, last name, or username, allow you to search for a person. So I wanted to search for Andrew Nelson. And then you have the opportunity, after you've added that user, to set a level of permission for them. Do you want them just to be able to read it? Do you want to give them write access? And if you give them ownership, that allows them to delete things delete that file as well. And now the other thing that you may want to do is you may want to make data publicly available. You may not want to go through the full process of issuing a DOI and having it registered in the CyVerse Data Commons. So what you can do is you can upload a file, click on those three little buttons, and then follow this link that says create or view a public link. And when you do that, you then have the opportunity to get a pop-up that will basically give you a unique URL that you then can share with collaborators. And so what I want to do with the end of my time, and I realize that I've been going a little slow, so I thank everyone for hanging on with this, is I want to make a copy of this presentation. Give me 1 second to get out of preview mode. I want to download this presentation and then upload it to the data store, generate a quick share link, post it in the chat, and see if anyone can go ahead and download it. So just as a quick question, would people like a PDF? I'm going to go for a PDF. I think that'll be just a little faster and more portable. So I'm going to download a PDF of this presentation. And I hope Google can render this relatively quickly. Rename this thing without that. And then I'm going to go to my data store, and I have a directory in here called talks. which will have a lot of talks in there. I'm going to go ahead and abort that for right now. I'm now going to put this talk into the talk directory in my data store account. I'll go ahead and just take a look at the progress. This is a 2 GB file, so that transferred relatively quickly. I'm now going to come over to the discovery environment. If you're not familiar with CyVerse, the web address for the discovery environment, also known as the DE, is de.cyverse.org. I already logged in earlier. So I'll go to my data. Go to eLions. Go to talks. Hope that that's not a big deal. Always during a live demo, does something go wrong. Go to talks. And I'm going to go ahead and sort this by last modified. There's my iCommands talk right there. I'm going to click on these 3 little dots, say create or view a public link. Copy that to my clipboard. So now anyone with this link can go ahead and access this file. But just to make this a little easier for people, I'm going to go to tinyurl and shrink this down to 2020 CyVerse iCommands. Go ahead and make that a teeny URL. I'll copy that, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in link for everyone. And can somebody go ahead and use that and tell me if you can download my talk as a PDF?
Works for me, which is great because now I don't have to bother you for your slides. I can have access to them. Thank you.
I would say you got the PDF, and I'm happy to make these things available as well.
More people are getting it too.
Cool. So, that's like one of the common things that I often do, especially when it comes to talks, is I'll make the little, I'll put it up in the data store. If it's not Google Slides, if it is Google Slides, I'll make sure it's fully public, and I'll make a teeny URL, slap it in on the end so that people can download it. So I'd go ahead and put a little box here, which is now not going to be on the slides. Download this presentation, and then you just go ahead and put that in there. And try to spell your words correctly. So I know I'm pushing the end of the hour. I do want to just leave you with some tips and tricks because I didn't go through everything. I can now double check to see if my checkpoint finished. Did I ignore my checkpoint? Oh, there it is. So here's my checkpoint up here. So this was the checkpoint from CyVerse, and I missed that. Here is the checksum from the file on my computer. Those 2 hashes are the same. File is identical. So now I would know not to have to go ahead and upload another version of it. So just in terms of some tips and tricks, I'll go ahead and just make this large so I can just step through them one by one. The data store is good for moving large files. It can move lots of small files, but I do recommend that if you are moving a lot of small files and you're going to be using them together all the time, make a tarball out of them. It'll just make everyone's life a lot easier. Just remember, once you authenticate with the iCommands using init, you're done. Your credentials are being stored in a hidden directory, and you now have the opportunity to shut your machine off, turn it back on, and just start using the data store automatically. If you are moving a lot of files around, one of the things that you may want to do before you move something really big is do some benchmarking. Take a small file, so before moving 100 gigs, try moving a gig, see how long that takes, because this is going to help you understand how long that big file transfer will take. And one of the things just to keep in mind is no matter how great and awesome any of these technologies are, if you're on a network that has low bandwidth, things are going to just take a really long time. And sometimes it may make sense just to move to a different network. So for example, I have the very bad internet at home. My upload speeds are just way too slow to do anything real. So if I do have work that I'm doing at home, I will bring it home on a flash drive, do my work, bring it back to work, and then upload it on my university network. And similarly, when even at your home institution, for those that are working not from home, some of your buildings may have different quality of network. So older buildings often have older networks and just may not be able to move data as quickly. So one of the things that I may do if I'm in an old building is I will walk over to a newer building, hop on Wi-Fi, get kicked off Wi-Fi because all the students are on it, and realize that I need a wired network if I really want to move these things. So there are some tips and tricks just in terms of what you're using to move your data network-wise. I showed you about checkpointing. Oh, sorry, I didn't tell you about checkpointing. One of the things the iCommands can do is checkpoint large transfers. So if you are interrupted, you do have the opportunity to resume. There's good documentation on that. This is especially useful if you're moving lots and lots and lots of files. And checksums, they are good. Always take good care of your data. And one of the things that I didn't get enough time to really run through is that there is no one technology that is best for everything. I really enjoy the iCommands and I really enjoy the data store for particular kinds of work. But SFTP, SCP, Globus, Google Drive, S3, Dropbox, all of these are different ways and they all have different strengths. And it just depends on what you're doing and what fits best. Often you may not have a choice. So if your data is up on some Globus point somewhere, you're going to have to use Globus to get the data out. And then you can do some other things. And similarly, when it comes to a lot of my work, I'm using Google Drive to keep my docs synced across everything. Used to use Dropbox, so on and so forth. I have no allegiance to any one technology as long as they're working to make my life a little easier. And so with that, I'm going to stop and just say you can download this presentation and that this work is supported by the National Science Foundation under a series of grants from DBI. And with that, I'll take any questions that you may have at the end and just want to thank you all for attending today. Tina, I turn it over.
Thanks. If there are any final questions, type them into the chat. Otherwise, I realize there is a lot of good information with links on the chat, so I'm going to try and save that and provide that as well so that people can have additional information. I appreciate all the answers on there from Nirav and Michele and Wayne and everybody else who weighed in with their own experience on things. That's what makes these webinars so helpful. So thanks very much on that, Eric. And I did want to mention that in 2 weeks, our next upcoming webinar is on how to use the Terrain API application programming interface, which works behind the discovery environment, and you can use it to automate workflows and other repetitive tasks. Our senior software engineer, Sarah Roberts, will be presenting that, so please join us in 2 weeks. And let's see if oh goodness, there's a few just thank yous in there, but thank you everybody, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks everyone.